Cold spring, 1945. Somewhere on the crumbling edge of Nuremberg, the smell of wet ash and burned timber hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Inside a half-destroyed farmhouse that nobody owned anymore, 12 German women sat in darkness, waiting to die. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? Dawn was coming, and with it, they believed, the end of everything. Helga Brandt pressed her forehead against the cold, cracked window frame. She was the oldest, 38, though the war had aged her beyond counting. Once, she had been a Red Cross nurse in Hamburg. She had pulled men from burning buildings, stitched wounds by candlelight, and held dying soldiers while they whispered the names of women she'd never meet. Now she was a prisoner. Behind her, the others huddled beneath threadbare army blankets that smelled like diesel and mud. There was Greta, a factory worker from Dresden, whose hands still bore the scars of molten steel. Liesel and Anna, twin secretaries who had typed propaganda they didn't believe in because the alternative was starvation. And then there was Ingrid Weber. Quiet, pale Ingrid, who clutched her violin case like it was a child. Ingrid hadn't played a note since their capture 3 days ago. She just stared at the wall with eyes that seemed to see through it, into some distant place the rest of them couldn't reach. They had been captured near Schweinfurt by elements of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division. American soldiers with hard eyes and harder voices had lined them up against a wall, checked their papers, and loaded them onto trucks without explanation. The ride had been long and silent. Nobody told them where they were going. Nobody told them why. But rumors traveled faster than trucks. In the holding camp, a cluster of barns and broken buildings surrounded by barbed wire, they had heard whispers. Stories about villages where SS officers had massacred civilians. Stories about revenge. Stories about how the Americans had stopped taking prisoners in certain towns. How they had started settling scores the old way. A firing squad at dawn. That's what everyone said was coming. Helga didn't know if it was true. She wanted to believe it wasn't, but she'd seen too much of this war to trust in mercy anymore. Mercy was a luxury that died somewhere between Stalingrad and D-Day. What remained was mathematics. Bodies for bodies, blood for blood. The Third Reich was collapsing like a building on fire, and they were trapped inside. Greta broke the silence first. Her voice came out, raw, as if she'd forgotten how to use it. "Do you think they'll let us write letters?" Nobody answered. "What would you even say?" "Dear Mother, I'll be dead by breakfast. Please forgive me for surviving this long." Liesel, or maybe it was Anna, even Helga couldn't tell them apart in the dark, started to cry. Soft, choked sobs that she tried to muffle with her sleeve. Her sister reached over and held her hand, squeezing tight, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. Ingrid remained still, staring at that invisible point beyond the wall. Helga wondered what she saw there. Hope? God? Or just the empty nothing that waits for everyone in the end? Outside, the night was dying. The eastern sky had begun to pale, just a faint suggestion of light, like smoke diluted in water. Dawn was an hour away, maybe less. Then they heard it, footsteps, boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, the unmistakable crunch of military-issue leather grinding against stone. Every woman in that room froze. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside the barn door. Helga's heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she thought it might crack them. She could hear the others holding their breath, could feel the terror radiating off their bodies like heat. A shadow moved across the gap beneath the door, Then came the sound that stopped time itself, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. This was it. This was the moment. Helga closed her eyes. She thought about Hamburg before the bombs. She thought about her mother's kitchen and the smell of black bread. She thought about a boy she'd loved when she was 17 and how he died at Kursk without ever knowing she'd loved him. She thought about how unfair it was that after everything, after all the blood and fire and screaming, it would end like this. Not in battle, not saving someone, just executed in a barn like an animal nobody wanted anymore. The door creaked open, light flooded in. Not sunlight, but the cold gray glow of pre-dawn. A silhouette filled the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably American. Helga waited for the order. Against the wall. Hands behind your head. Face forward. But the order never came. Instead, a voice spoke. Quiet, almost gentle, and in broken, heavily accented German. Don't be afraid. Helga opened her eyes. The man stood in the doorway, his helmet tucked under one arm. His rifle hung loose on his shoulder strap. Not raised, not aimed, just there. His face was hard to see against the backlight, but his posture wasn't that of an executioner. It was something else entirely. My name's Sergeant Daniel Crow, he continued in that clumsy, careful German. Nobody's dying tonight. The words hung in the air, like something fragile. A soap bubble that might pop if anyone breathed too hard. Helga stared at him. She didn't understand. Couldn't understand. In her mind, Americans were the enemy. They were the ones who had firebombed Dresden, who had turned Hamburg into a crematorium, who had left German cities as nothing but ash and corpses and the ghosts of children who'd never grow old. They weren't supposed to sound kind. Daniel Crow stepped inside and placed a single oil lantern on the floor near the door. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across his face. He looked tired. No, more than tired. He looked like a man who'd seen the bottom of the world and couldn't find his way back up. I'll be outside, he said. Try to rest. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. For a long time, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the lantern burning in the darkness, at the small circle of light that pushed back the shadows but couldn't quite reach the corners. Finally, Greta whispered what they were all thinking. It's a trick. Maybe it was. Maybe the Americans wanted them awake and terrified. Maybe they wanted to watch hope bloom just so they could crush it at dawn. Psychological warfare. Break them first, then kill them. But Helga had noticed something. Daniel Crow's uniform was covered in mud stains, not blood. His rifle strap was frayed and patched with wire, like it had been repaired a dozen times. His boots were worn almost through at the heels. He looked like a man who'd been fighting too long, like a man who was tired of death, not like a man preparing to deliver it. Maybe, Helga said quietly, or maybe not. Outside, the sky continued its slow transformation from black to gray. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Stupid bird. Didn't it know there was a war on? The women settled back into their positions, but nobody slept. They just waited, watching the lantern flame and listening to the sounds of the camp waking up around them. Trucks rumbling, men shouting orders in English. The clatter of equipment being loaded and unloaded. Normal sounds, military sounds, not execution sounds, unless that's exactly what execution sounded like now. As the light grew stronger, Helga returned to the window. Through the cracks in the wood, she could see the courtyard. American soldiers moved about their morning routines, some smoking cigarettes, others hauling crates from trucks. They looked ordinary. just men doing their jobs. But that's what scared her most, because ordinary men do terrible things in war. Good men, kind men, men who would never hurt anyone in peacetime suddenly become capable of anything when someone tells them it's necessary. She'd seen it happen to Germans. Why would Americans be any different? The minutes crawled by like wounded animals. 30, 45. The sun was rising now, painting the Bavarian hills in shades of gold and amber that seemed obscene in their beauty. How dare the world be beautiful on the morning you expect to die? Then they heard it. The sound of engines. Multiple vehicles pulling into the courtyard. The women stood as one, instinct pulling them to their feet. Through the gaps in the barn walls, Helga saw them. Olive green trucks, 3 of them parking in a neat row. American soldiers jumped down from the backs, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Not like men preparing for an execution, like men arriving for breakfast. Daniel Crow hadn't slept. He had spent the night sitting on an overturned ammunition crate outside the barn, smoking cigarettes he didn't taste, and watching the stars fade into morning. His rifle lay across his knees. Safety on, magazine half empty, because they were all running low on everything now. Ammunition, food, patience, hope. He was 26 years old and felt 60. Kansas seemed like a dream from someone else's life. The farm where he'd grown up, the girl he'd loved in high school, the future he'd imagined. All of it was buried under 3 years of mud, blood, and the kind of memories that don't wash off. He had landed at Normandy, fought through France, watched boys younger than him die in ways that would make you stop believing in God if you thought about it too long. And now, this. 12 German women who were supposed to be dead by morning. The order had come down 2 days before. Not in writing, but in whispers. A captain from division, Daniel never learned his name, had pulled their lieutenant aside after evening formation. The conversation was short. When it ended, the lieutenant's face had gone white. That night, in the command tent, Daniel and 5 other NCOs were briefed. POW situation, the lieutenant had said, not meeting anyone's eyes. 12 female detainees. German nationals, some with party affiliations. Intel suggests possible collaboration in war crimes, specific village incidents near Würzburg. He had paused there, like the words were rocks he had to swallow. Standing order is resolution by dawn. Quick, quiet, no paperwork. Resolution. That's what they were calling murder now. Corporal Mike Bennett, a kid from Boston, who still wrote letters to his mother every week, had been the first to speak. Sir, with respect, are we talking about what I think we're talking about? The lieutenant had looked at him then, really looked at him, and Daniel had seen something break behind the man's eyes. I didn't give this order, Corporal. It came from higher up, way higher. There's pressure to make examples, to show the Germans there are consequences. For women? That was Sergeant Tom Hayes, who had a daughter back in Philadelphia. For secretaries and nurses? For collaborators, the lieutenant had corrected, but his voice had no strength in it. That's the word that's being used. Daniel had felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd killed men in combat, lots of them. He'd shot German soldiers who were just doing their jobs, who probably had families and farms and futures they'd never see. That was war. That was the terrible math of survival. But this was something else. And what if we don't? Daniel had asked quietly. The tent went silent. The lieutenant stared at him. "Don't what, Sergeant?" "Don't carry out the order." For a moment, nobody breathed. Refusing an order, even an illegal one, was court-martial territory. Maybe worse. But the lieutenant had surprised him. He'd sighed, taken off his helmet, and run a hand through his hair. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then I never gave you the order. You never heard it. And those women are just POWs awaiting transfer. Standard protocol." It was the bravest thing Daniel had ever seen an officer do. Walk away from an atrocity and pretend it never existed. So that's what they did. They put the women in the barn, posted a guard rotation, and waited to see what would happen when dawn came and the bodies weren't there. Now, dawn was here, and Daniel was still waiting. Behind him, he heard footsteps. He turned to see Private Jack Reynolds approaching, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. Jack was 19. Blonde, built like a farmhand, because that's exactly what he'd been 6 months ago. He had the kind of face that looked like it had never met a problem it couldn't solve with hard work and a smile. War hadn't beaten that out of him yet. Daniel hoped it never would. "Figured you could use this, Sarge," Jack said, handing over one of the cups. Daniel took it gratefully. The coffee was terrible, burnt and weak, but it was hot, and that was enough. "They still in there?" Jack asked, nodding toward the barn. "Where else would they go?" Jack sat down on another crate, sipping his coffee and watching the sunrise. For a while, they didn't talk. Just 2 soldiers sharing a quiet moment before the world decided to end them or let them live another day. Finally, Jack spoke. "My dad always said you can tell a lot about a man by how he treats people who can't fight back." Daniel glanced at him. "Your dad sounds smart." "He was." Jack's voice went soft. "Died when I was 16. Tractor accident." "I'm sorry." Jack shrugged. "He taught me enough before he went. Taught me that doing the right thing ain't always the same as following orders." Daniel smiled grimly. "That's a dangerous lesson in the Army." "Maybe. But it's still true." They fell silent again as the camp continued waking up around them. More soldiers emerging from tents, stretching, yawning, and complaining about the cold. Morning formation would be soon. And after that, Daniel didn't know what came after that. Would division send someone to check? Would there be consequences for the missing bodies? Or would everyone just pretend it never happened, the way they pretended so many things never happened in this war? At 7:15, the 3 trucks rolled into the courtyard. Daniel stood up instantly, alert. Jack did the same. The trucks parked in formation, and soldiers began jumping down from the beds. Members of their own company, guys Daniel had fought beside for months. Sergeant Hayes was there, and Corporal Bennett, and a half-dozen others. And they were unloading crates. Not ammunition, not weapons. Food. Daniel walked over, confused. Hayes saw him coming and grinned. Actually grinned. Like they were planning a picnic instead of defying an execution order. "Morning, Crow," Hayes said cheerfully. "Hope you're hungry." "What the hell is this?" Hayes pulled open one of the crates. Inside, tins of powdered scrambled eggs, loaves of bread, cans of coffee, even some apples someone had scrounged from God knows where. "Breakfast," Hayes said simply. "Figured if we're keeping them alive, might as well feed them proper. Can't have POWs dying of starvation on our watch. That would be inhumane." The way he said that last word, heavy with irony, made Daniel want to laugh and cry at the same time. "You're all insane," he muttered. Bennett appeared next to him, carrying a stack of tin plates. Probably, but we're doing it anyway. Other soldiers began setting up a makeshift serving line, field tables, cooking equipment, all the standard gear for feeding troops. Except this time, they were feeding the enemy. Or were they? Daniel looked at these men, his brothers, and realized that somewhere along the way, they'd all made the same choice without discussing it. They had decided there were some lines you didn't cross, even in war, especially in war, because if you crossed those lines, what were you even fighting for? At 7:30, Daniel walked back to the barn. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't say exactly why. Nervousness, fear, or maybe just the weight of what they were about to do. Feed the condemned, and in doing so, declare that they refuse to be executioners. He opened the door. The women were standing, lined up against the far wall, like they'd been waiting for this moment. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and terror. Helga Brandt stood at the front, her chin raised, defiant or resigned. Daniel couldn't tell which. For a moment, he just looked at them. Really looked. They weren't monsters. They weren't war criminals. They were just women. Tired, scared women who'd gotten caught in the machinery of something bigger and more terrible than all of them. "Line up outside," Daniel said in German, keeping his voice firm but not harsh. Slowly. No sudden movements. They obeyed, filing out into the morning light, blinking against the sun, like prisoners emerging from a cave. The American soldiers waited, holding plates and cups. Daniel could see the confusion spreading across the women's faces. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't how executions worked. "Form a line," he said. They did, hands trembling. And then the Americans began serving them breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bread, apples, coffee, real food, hot food. Helga was first in line. Jack Reynolds handed her a plate, then a cup. She took them mechanically, like her brain couldn't process what was happening. She stared at the food, then at Jack, then back at the food. "Why?" she whispered in English, the word cracking in her throat. Jack gave her that farm boy smile. "Orders, ma'am. You're human, ain't you?" Something broke in her face then. Not fear, but something deeper. Some wall that propaganda and war and hatred had built, crumbling all at once. The other women received their portions in stunned silence. Some started crying as they ate. Others just stood there, holding their plates like they'd forgotten what to do with them. Daniel watched it all, feeling something strange and unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not pride, exactly, but maybe something close. Maybe this was what winning actually looked like. Not defeating an enemy, but refusing to become one. They ate in silence. Not the silence of fear anymore, but something else. Something quieter, more fragile. Helga Brandt sat on a wooden crate in the courtyard, the tin plate balanced on her knees, and tried to remember the last time she'd tasted real coffee. Not the bitter acorn substitute they'd been drinking in Germany for the past 2 years, but actual coffee, dark and strong, and almost offensively American in its abundance. It was good. God help her. It was good. Around her, the other women ate slowly, cautiously, like they were afraid the food might disappear if they moved too fast. Greta had tears running down her face as she chewed a piece of bread. The twins sat pressed together, sharing an apple between them. Even Ingrid had set down her violin case and was holding a cup of coffee in both hands, staring into it, like it contained answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. The American soldiers stood nearby, not guarding exactly, but present. Some smoked cigarettes. Others drank their own coffee and talked in low voices. They didn't look threatening. They looked tired, just as tired as the women they were feeding. Daniel Crow approached Helga slowly, like he was worried about startling her. He pulled up another crate and sat down a respectful distance away. For a moment, they didn't speak. Just two people who'd been on opposite sides of a war, sharing a morning that neither of them had expected to see. Finally, Daniel spoke. His German was clumsy, but earnest. "You were supposed to be transferred," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "At least, that's what the paperwork says." Helga looked at him. "But someone higher up wanted you dead." He said it flatly, without emotion, as if he were reporting the weather. They thought revenge, examples, justice, they called it. "And you disagreed?" It wasn't a question. Daniel met her eyes then, and she saw something in them that shocked her more than the breakfast had. Shame. Not for what he'd done, but for what his country had almost done. "We didn't sign up to execute prisoners," he said. "Especially not—" He trailed off, gestured vaguely at the women around them. "Especially not people who never held a rifle." Helga felt something twist in her chest. "So this breakfast, this kindness, it's not mercy." "No, ma'am." Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's mutiny." The word hung in the air like smoke. Mutiny. Defiance. A quiet rebellion by a handful of soldiers who had decided that some orders weren't orders at all. They were tests. Tests of whether you'd remain human or become something else. "They'll punish you," Helga said. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. War's ending anyway. Everything's chaos. Maybe they'll just forget." But he didn't sound convinced. Before Helga could respond, the sound of an engine cut through the morning air. Different from the trucks. Sharper, more official. A jeep roared into the courtyard, kicking up dust, and skidded to a stop near the serving area. An officer climbed out. He was older than the soldiers around him, maybe 40, with silver starting to show at his temples, and the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled at anything that wasn't a regulation. His uniform was cleaner than everyone else's, his boots polished to a shine that seemed obscene in a war zone. Daniel stood immediately. So did the other soldiers. The officer's eyes swept across the scene, the women sitting with plates of food, the Americans who'd served them, the crates of supplies still being unpacked. His expression went from confusion to fury in about 3 seconds. "Who authorized this?" His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Nobody answered. The officer's gaze landed on Daniel. "Sergeant, I ask you a question." Daniel straightened his shoulders. "Sir, these women are Red Cross personnel, civilians, and musicians, not combatants, according to the Geneva Convention. I don't need a lecture on the Geneva Convention from a non-com sergeant." The officer stepped closer, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "I need to know who countermanded a direct order from division." "There was no written order, sir." "Don't play games with me." Daniel didn't flinch. "Sir, these women haven't been charged with any specific crimes. No trial, no evidence presented. We couldn't, in good conscience, carry out an execution based on rumors and revenge." The courtyard had gone completely silent. Even the women had stopped eating, sensing that something important was happening. even if they couldn't understand all the English being spoken. The officer glared at Daniel for what felt like an hour. Then he looked at the other soldiers. Hayes, Bennett, Reynolds, all of them standing at attention, but clearly on Daniel's side. Finally, the officer spoke, each word measured and deliberate. Fine, but you take responsibility, all of it. If there's any blowback, any investigation, any problems, it's on you, Sergeant Crow. Your name goes in the report. Your career, your freedom. Understood? Understood, sir. The officer stared at him a moment longer, then turned on his heel and walked back to his jeep. He paused before climbing in, looked back over his shoulder. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice was different now, tired, almost human. I'm glad someone still has a conscience around here. Then he drove away, leaving nothing but dust and silence. Daniel exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. Around him, the other soldiers relaxed fractionally. Jack Reynolds came up beside him, grinning. Well, that could have gone worse. Could have gone better, too. Nah, Sarge. We kept our souls. That's a win in my book. Daniel wanted to believe him, but he'd seen too much of this war to believe in clean wins anymore. That afternoon, they moved the women to a proper holding facility, a commandeered school building with beds, blankets, and doors that locked from the outside, but at least had windows that opened. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't a barn. As they were being processed, an intelligence officer arrived to conduct interviews. He was young, maybe 23, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of earnest face that suggested he'd been a librarian before the war. He called them in one at a time. Helga went first. The questions were standard: name, occupation, political affiliations, knowledge of military operations. She answered honestly. She'd been a nurse. She'd never joined the party. She'd saved lives, not taken. Then came Greta. Then the twins. Then Ingrid. Ingrid Weber, the quiet violinist who'd barely spoken since their capture. The interview took longer than the others. Much longer. When Ingrid finally emerged, her face was white as chalk. The intelligence officer called Daniel into his makeshift office, a classroom with the desks pushed against the walls and a folding table in the center. Sergeant, the officer said, not looking up from his notes. We have a problem. Sir? Ingrid Weber, the musician? Daniel felt his stomach drop. What about her? The officer looked up then, his expression grim. She wasn't just playing music for the troops. She was part of a signal intelligence operation. The Wehrmacht had her encoding messages into musical performances, specific notes, specific rhythms. She'd play at various camps and facilities, and German intelligence would decode the patterns to coordinate movements. Daniel stared at him. She's a spy. Technically, yes, though she claims she didn't volunteer. That she was conscripted into it after they discovered she had perfect pitch. Says she only did it to protect her family. Do you believe her? The officer removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Honestly, I don't know. But it doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that the Soviets want her. They've been hunting for members of that particular intelligence unit for months. If they find out we have her... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what the Soviets did to German spies. What happens now? Daniel asked. I have to report it. That's protocol. Within 48 hours, she'll be transferred to Soviet custody. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's a death sentence. That's war, Sergeant. But Daniel had heard those words too many times. They'd been used to justify too many things that shouldn't be justified. He'd saved these women from an execution at dawn. Was he really going to let one of them die in a Soviet prison just because some protocol said he had to? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep again. He sat outside the school building, smoking and thinking. Around midnight, Sergeant Hayes found him there. "You're going to help her escape, aren't you?" Hayes said, without preamble. Daniel didn't answer right away. "That's court-martial talk, Tom. That's not a no. It's not a yes, either." Hayes sat down beside him. "For what it's worth, I think the girl's telling the truth. I think she got caught in something bigger than her and did what she had to do to survive. That's not a crime. That's just human. The Soviets won't see it that way." "No, they won't." They sat in silence for a while. Then Hayes spoke again, quieter this time. "My daughter's 14, back in Philadelphia. Sometimes I wonder what I'd want someone to do for her if she got caught up in something like this. If she made mistakes trying to stay alive in an impossible situation." He stood up, stretched, and headed back toward the barracks. "Just saying," he called over his shoulder. "Whatever you decide, you weren't alone in that barn. You're not alone now either." Daniel sat there for another hour, watching the stars and thinking about mercy, justice, and the terrible gray space between them. Then he made his decision. The next morning, when the guards went to collect Ingrid Weber for her transfer, her cell was empty. The window was open, the bed was made, and on the pillow was her violin, carefully placed, with a note that read simply, "I'm sorry." They searched for 2 days. They never found her. The official report stated that the prisoner had escaped during the night, possibly with outside assistance, but that no evidence could be conclusively tied to any specific individual. Daniel was questioned 3 times. He maintained that he'd been in the barracks all night, sleeping. Sergeant Hayes confirmed it. Jack Reynolds, too. Corporal Bennett, too. Nobody could prove otherwise. Eventually, the investigation was quietly closed. There were bigger problems to deal with. The war was ending. Germany was collapsing. And one missing spy didn't seem worth the paperwork. But Daniel knew the truth. And so did Helga, who had watched from her window as a shadow slipped through the courtyard just before dawn, carrying a violin case and moving with purpose toward the tree line beyond the fence. She never said a word. Some mercies, she decided, were worth protecting. The war ended 32 days later. Germany surrendered. The camps were liberated. The soldiers went home, carrying memories they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to forget or make sense of. Daniel Crow returned to Ohio in September 1945. He moved back to his hometown, a place called Tiffin, population 8,000, where the biggest news was usually about high school football and the county fair. He got a job with the Postal Service. He married a girl named Ruth, who'd waited for him while he was overseas. They bought a small house on Elm Street with a front porch and a yard big enough for the kids they hoped to have someday. Life was quiet, normal, almost unbearably peaceful after the thunder of war. But some nights, Daniel would wake up at 3 in the morning, his heart racing, convinced he heard boots on gravel and the click of a rifle bolt. He'd lie there in the dark, listening to Ruth breathe beside him, and wonder about those 12 women in the barn. Were they alive? Had they made it through the chaos of the war's end? Had they gone home to families? Or had their homes been destroyed? He'd never know. At least, that's what he thought. 6 years passed. It was October 1951, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way, except one. Daniel was halfway through his mail route when he noticed something unusual. A package addressed to him, at the post office. No return address. Foreign postage. The stamps were French. He finished his route, then took the package home. Ruth was at the grocery store. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the brown paper wrapping, almost afraid to open it. Finally, he did. Inside was a photograph. It showed a woman sitting on a street corner in what looked like Paris. You could see the Eiffel Tower, blurred, in the background. She was young, maybe 25, with light hair pulled back in a simple style. And she was playing a violin for a small crowd of tourists who'd stopped to listen. Her face was peaceful, not happy exactly, but serene, like someone who'd survived something terrible and come out the other side, still capable of making music. On the back of the photograph, written in careful English, Danke für das Frühstück im Morgengrauen. Thank you for the breakfast at dawn. I.W. Ingrid Weber. Daniel sat there for a long time, holding that photograph, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Relief? Vindication? Or just the simple, profound satisfaction of knowing that mercy hadn't been wasted. She'd lived. She'd survived. She was free. He never told anyone about the photograph. He kept it in his desk drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, hidden beneath old tax documents and forgotten birthday cards. Sometimes, on the anniversary of that morning in April 1945, he'd take it out and look at it. Ruth knew something had happened during the war, something important that Daniel never talked about. She didn't press. Some stories, she understood, belonged to the people who'd lived them. In 1959, Daniel received another letter. This one had a German postmark. Stuttgart. He opened it carefully. Dear Sergeant Crow, you won't remember me, but I remember you. My name is Helga Brandt. In April 1945, you saved my life and the lives of 11 other women. I have wanted to write to you for years, but I didn't know how to find you. Then last month, I read an article in an American magazine about small-town postmen, and your name was mentioned. I took a chance that it was you. I need you to know what happened to us after the war. Most of us survived. Greta returned to Dresden, or what was left of it, and helped rebuild the city. The twins went to Berlin and opened a small bakery. Some of the others immigrated to America or Canada or Australia, looking for fresh starts in places that didn't know their histories. I became a nurse again. I work at a hospital here in Stuttgart. Every day, I try to save lives, just as you saved mine. But I wanted you to know something else, something I've never told anyone. That morning, when you brought us breakfast instead of bullets, you didn't just save our bodies. You saved something more important. You saved our faith that the world could still be decent, that people could still choose mercy over revenge. We had been taught for years that Americans were brutal enemies, that the Allies were monsters who would destroy Germany without pity. And then you appeared with scrambled eggs, coffee, and simple human kindness. You broke the propaganda in a way no political speech ever could. I have children now, 2 daughters. I tell them about that morning sometimes, about how the world was ending, and a stranger chose to be kind anyway. I tell them that's what courage really looks like. Not fighting, not killing, but refusing to become the monster that war wants you to be. I hope you have found peace, Sergeant Crow. I hope America has treated you better than Germany treated us. And I hope you know that what you did mattered. It still matters. With deep gratitude, Helga Brandt. Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down and wrote back a short note, thanking her and wishing her well. They exchanged letters occasionally after that. Christmas cards, brief updates on their lives, little windows into the people they'd become after the war had finished breaking them. Years turned into decades. Daniel retired from the Postal Service in 1980. Ruth died in 1987, and he mourned her the way you mourn someone who'd saved you just as surely as you'd saved anyone in the war. His children grew up, moved away, started their own families. He became a grandfather, then a great-grandfather. The world moved on. But the photograph remained in his desk drawer, and the memory of that April morning remained in his heart, sharp and clear and unchanging. He died in 1994, at the age of 75, in his sleep. Peaceful, surrounded by family. At his funeral, his son David found the photograph while going through his father's papers. He asked his mother's sister, Daniel's last surviving sibling, if she knew the story behind it. She didn't. So, David did some research. He contacted military archives, tracked down old unit records, interviewed surviving members of the 45th Infantry Division. Slowly, piece by piece, the story emerged. In 1998, David arranged for a small memorial to be placed in the Tiffin Historical Society. A plaque with his father's name and a simple inscription: Sergeant Daniel Crow, U.S. Army, 1944-1945. He chose mercy when orders demanded vengeance. The plaque is still there today. Most people walk past it without stopping. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, someone will pause, read it, and wonder what story hides behind those words. What choice was made? What orders were refused? What mercy was given? They'll never know the full truth, because the Army's official records only say this: POW transfer, April 18, 1945. 12 female detainees relocated to Allied command. No casualties. 18 words that hide a revolution. No official report ever mentioned the illegal execution order. No document ever recorded the mutiny. No investigation ever proved who helped Ingrid Weber escape. The truth was buried under paperwork, time, and the collective decision of everyone involved to forget that it had ever happened. But in a dusty museum in Topeka, Kansas, the hometown of Jack Reynolds, who died in 2003, there's a photograph hanging on the wall. It shows a group of women in tattered clothes, holding tin cups and plates, surrounded by American soldiers. They're not smiling, not exactly, but they're alive. And that's enough. The caption reads, Nuremberg vicinity, April 1945, breakfast service. If you look closely at the photograph, you can see Helga Brandt in the center, staring directly at the camera. Her expression is complicated, exhausted, grateful, confused, relieved, all at once. But there's something else in her eyes, too. A question that history still hasn't answered. Was it mercy? Or was it guilt? Were those American soldiers trying to save lives, or save their own souls? Maybe both. Maybe that's what real heroism looks like. Not grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but small acts of defiance against the machinery of hatred. Choosing to feed someone when you're ordered to kill them. Choosing humanity when the world has given you permission to be a monster. Nobody knows what happened to Ingrid Weber after that photograph in Paris. Some say she moved to Argentina. Others say she changed her name and disappeared into post-war Europe. just another displaced person on a continent full of them. But somewhere in the world, maybe Paris, maybe Buenos Aires, maybe a small town nobody's ever heard of, there might be an old woman who still plays violin on street corners. And sometimes, late at night, when the crowds have gone, she might play a melody that sounds like gratitude, like survival, like the morning when someone chose mercy over revenge and changed the course of one life forever. That's the thing about small acts of kindness in wartime. They echo. They ripple outward in ways you'll never see, touching lives you'll never meet, changing futures you'll never witness. Daniel Crowe never knew that Helga's daughters became doctors who saved thousands of lives. He never knew that one of them moved to America, married a man from New York, and that their son became a teacher who taught history to inner-city kids and told them the story of his great-grandmother who learned about mercy from an enemy soldier. He never knew that Ingrid Weber, if she survived, if the stories are true, taught violin to refugee children in the 1960s, passing on not just music, but the lesson that survival and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. He never knew the full extent of the good that came from one simple choice: to bring breakfast instead of bullets, to choose hope over hatred, to remain human when the world had given up on humanity. All he knew was that on one cold April morning in 1945, he'd had a choice between following orders and following his conscience, and he'd chosen his conscience. That's the story we need to remember. Not just the battles, the generals, and the dates that fill history books, but the small moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices, when soldiers became philosophers, when enemies became human beings, when mercy won a quiet victory that no military campaign could achieve. Because wars end, nations change, borders shift, and political systems rise and fall. But the choice between cruelty and kindness, that choice is eternal. And every time we make it, we're standing in that same courtyard, holding the same question: what kind of person will I be when the world gives me permission to be terrible? Daniel Crowe answered that question. So did Sergeant Hayes and Jack Reynolds and all those soldiers who decided that some orders aren't worth following. They answered it with scrambled eggs and coffee, with breakfast at dawn,